April 8, 1943, high over the fields and broken cloud layers near Caen, occupied France. The air is thin, the light is sharp, and every breath tastes like rubber and metal through an oxygen mask. Oberleutnant Rolf Herrmichen, a seasoned pilot with Jagdgeschwader 26, watches a new shape crawl upward toward his formation. Through the clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, he studies them the way a hunter studies unfamiliar prey. They're not Spitfires, not Mustangs, not anything the Luftwaffe has learned to respect. They're huge, big-barreled fighters with fat fuselages and canopies that look like glass greenhouses, wings that seem almost too modest for the mass they're carrying, propellers that look oversized, like someone scaled up a normal fighter and forgot to refine the lines. Herrmichen keys his radio, voice amused. "They've sent us flying milk bottles," he tells his wingman, unable to hide the laugh. Below, 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group grind upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp radials working like industrial machines against the weight of the airframe. To German pilots used to sleek, responsive fighters, and to the knife fight turning battles they'd been winning since 1939, these American machines look like a joke that wandered into the wrong war. But Herrmichen is missing the only detail that matters. He's looking at shape. He isn't looking at the future, because what's climbing toward him isn't a punchline. It's a system, a design philosophy, an airborne expression of industrial logic that will, piece by piece, dismantle the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. And the first clue is hidden in the Thunderbolt's broad wings. 8 synchronized AN-M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, not 2, not 4, 8, ammunition in bulk, 3,400 rounds total, a combined rate of fire around 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated energy that, at the right distance, a short burst can cut an aircraft apart faster than the pilot can understand he's been hit. The mathematics of destruction are already there, waiting for tactics to catch up. That morning, the Germans circle above like wolves positioning for an easy kill. Down below, Major Donald Blakesley, recently transferred from RAF Spitfires and now commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spots the movement and instantly recognizes the danger. Blakesley also recognizes something else. The instincts his pilots are about to rely on will get them killed, because the P-47 is not a Spitfire. It is not a light interceptor built to dance in a turning fight. It is a different kind of weapon, one that demands a different kind of discipline, and the men flying it that day are not ready, not yet. Among the Americans spread across the sky are future aces, names that will eventually claw their way into Luftwaffe nightmares. But on April 8, 1943, they are new to an untested aircraft facing the most experienced fighter force on Earth. German pilots have been fighting continuously since Poland, since France, since Britain, since the Eastern Front devoured entire squadrons. American pilots in Europe have been in combat for exactly 0 days. This story is about what happens when tactical brilliance meets an enemy that can absorb mistakes, learn quickly, and then mass-produce the lesson. It is about how German laughter becomes caution, then urgency, then dread. And it begins years earlier. In a panic, June 1940, France is collapsing. German fighters carve through the skies, and in the United States, the Army Air Corps issues urgent requirements for a high-altitude interceptor that can meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, Georgian-born, stubborn, brilliant, receives the specifications and understands the problem immediately. High altitude demands power. Power demands air. Air at altitude is scarce. So Kartveli designs around a concept the Americans are willing to embrace: Big engine, turbo supercharger, heavy structure, and enough fuel, armor, and guns to survive a bad day. He's honest with his team. It'll be a dinosaur, he says, but a dinosaur with good proportions. The prototype XP-47B takes to the air on May 6, 1941, and shocks nearly everyone who sees it. Empty, it weighs close to 9,900 pounds. That's not a little heavy. That's a different category. The massive turbo supercharger system and its ducting fill the rear fuselage, giving the aircraft a bulky, almost swollen look. Test pilots walking up to it for the first time ask the same question, half joking, half serious. This thing actually flies. It does. And at altitude, it flies like something built for a different planet. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing around 2,000 horsepower, can keep delivering power. Where other engines thin out, the turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, can maintain near sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where conventional superchargers run out of breath. But raw capability comes with a price. When the aircraft reaches training units, it kills pilots. Not in combat, but in mistakes. It ground loops on landing. Torque can roll it on takeoff if you're sloppy. It dives so eagerly that pilots learn about compressibility the hard way. Controls locking as shock waves form on the wing. At Bridgeport, Connecticut, during training in late 1942 into early 1943, the 56th Fighter Group loses men and aircraft in accidents. The Thunderbolt is unforgiving. It does not reward casual confidence. And yet, the pilots who master it start describing it with a different tone, a mix of awe and respect. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, who will later rack up a staggering victory tally, explains his first flight with a line that sounds exaggerated until you see the airplane. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive, he says. "You didn't fly it, you aimed it." Then comes combat. Early encounters in April and May 1943 seem to confirm everything German pilots assumed. The P-47 can't turn with the FW-190. It can't climb like the Bf-109 in the low to medium altitude bands where most dogfights happen. The controls feel heavy, and if an American pilot tries to fight like a Spitfire pilot, the Thunderbolt will lose. Luftwaffe pilots quickly develop a routine: attack from below where the big fighter struggles, force the turn, keep the fight tight, make it a knife fight, make agility decide the outcome. Some German combat reports mock the machine outright. Spitfire squadrons observing from nearby even quietly suggest the Americans may have chosen the wrong mount. And for a moment, the numbers look grim. In those first weeks, Thunderbolts are lost faster than they claim victories. The Germans feel validated. The jokes spread. The confidence hardens. But something is happening in the background. Something German intelligence doesn't properly measure. When a P-47 goes down, it often goes down late. Pilots report returning with damage that would have shredded lighter fighters. A Thunderbolt limps home with holes that should have caused catastrophic failure. The radial engine has no vulnerable liquid cooling system to puncture. Armor protects critical areas. The structure is thick, stubborn, difficult to break, and more importantly, when the Thunderbolt finally gets its guns on target, the results are not hits, they are catastrophes. 850 calibers create a convergent zone that is new to German experience. Earlier, fighters might carry rifle-caliber weapons or cannon with limited ammunition. The P-47 can hold the trigger and keep a dense stream on target, longer than most pilots can psychologically process. It's sustained, concentrated, and brutally consistent. The moment that begins changing the psychological balance arrives on June 26, 1943, over Forges-le-Haut, France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson is flying with a formation of 48 P-47s, returning from escort duty when they are jumped by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Messerschmitt JG-26. The Germans execute what they believe is a perfect attack, diving out of the sun with a speed advantage and clean angles. Johnson's aircraft is at the rear, the worst place to be when predators strike. In seconds, his Thunderbolt is ripped open, cannon shells slam into the machine. The canopy shatters. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the cockpit. Panels tear away. Fire bursts behind the instrument cluster. Johnson is wounded in the nose and leg by fragments and bullets. He tries to bail out and discovers the nightmare. The canopy is jammed. A shell has detonated in the track and effectively welded it shut. He is trapped at 27,000 feet inside a dying aircraft with the cold, and the wind and the violence of the sky pressing in from every side. What happens next should not happen. Through oil and debris, with forward visibility collapsing, the engine shaking violently, controls responding only in partial, sluggish ways, Johnson manages to level the aircraft. He points it towards the channel. He keeps it flying, and then the story becomes almost surreal. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 finds him limping toward the water at a low speed, barely around 170 miles per hour. The German pilot slides into position behind the damaged Thunderbolt and opens fire with cannon and machine guns. Johnson can't evade. He can only hunch behind armor and wait for the moment the airframe finally gives up. The FW-190 empties its cannon ammunition. The Thunderbolt continues. The German pilot repositions, firing again, now relying on machine guns alone. Still, the P-47 remains in the air. He comes alongside and looks into the cockpit. Johnson sees the man clearly. Young, blonde, expression shifting as he realizes what he is witnessing. Confidence to confusion, confusion to something dangerously close to fear. The German pilot fires his remaining ammunition. The P-47 does not fall. Finally, the Focke-Wulf eases alongside again, the pilot shaking his head. In a gesture that looks like an informal salute, he peels away, out of ammunition, out of options, out of certainty. Johnson's Thunderbolt reaches Manston and lands with the engine failing at the runway. On the ground, the crew chief stops counting holes after passing 200. Structural members are shot through. Control runs are damaged. Armor plates bear scars where shells detonated close enough to kill him. Yet the aircraft brought him home, and the implications hit both air forces like a cold wind. American engineers study the wreck and realize they may have underestimated their own machine. German intelligence receives the reports and hesitates, almost refusing to believe them. Not because they're naive, but because the idea violates everything they thought they knew about what fighter aircraft can endure. But multiple pilots confirm it. The Thunderbolt absorbed the full attention of a first-class Luftwaffe fighter and lived. That is the turning point. Because once American pilots understand they are not flying a ballet dancer, but a sledgehammer, everything changes. By July 1943, lessons harden into doctrine, led by men like Lieutenant Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, a commander who learns through brutal repetition and refuses to let his pilots die, chasing the wrong kind of fight. His guidance becomes simple, almost blunt. Don't turn with them. Don't try to outclimb them down low. Use altitude, use weight, use power, use speed in the dive, use the guns. The Thunderbolt's mass, once mocked as a flaw, becomes a weapon, and the sky over Europe is about to learn what that weapon looks like when it's finally used correctly. Once American pilots stop trying to make the Thunderbolt behave like a European fighter, its real personality emerges. The P-47 does not want to dance. It wants to fall. From altitude, gravity becomes an ally. With its enormous mass and clean dive profile, the Thunderbolt accelerates like nothing the Luftwaffe fields. From 30,000 feet, it can plunge toward the Earth at speeds that make German gun sights useless. Deflection angles vanish, timing collapses. A pilot lining up a shot watches the target simply disappear downward. German fighters try to follow and discover they cannot. The P-47's dive speed pushes into regions where compressibility begins to punish lighter airframes. Controls stiffen, airframes shudder. German pilots are forced to break off or risk structural failure. The Thunderbolt, built thick and over-engineered, keeps going. At the bottom of the dive, speed becomes altitude again. The American fighter zooms back upward, trading velocity for height, climbing out of danger before the enemy can respond. This is not dogfighting, it is energy warfare. Pilots begin calling it boom and zoom, but among Thunderbolt squadrons it earns a darker nickname: the turkey shoot. The enemy never turns the fight. They never get the chance. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, one of the early American aces, refines the approach. Climb higher than the enemy can effectively operate. Lurk above the fight. When German aircraft appear below, roll inverted, dive straight through them, fire once, and leave. No turning, no chasing, no second pass unless conditions are perfect. Just controlled violence delivered from altitude. German pilots begin describing the experience with a new vocabulary: not engagement, not combat. They talk about sudden walls of fire, about aircraft vanishing, about formations collapsing in seconds. The 850 caliber machine guns speak together, not in bursts, but in sustained streams. Each Thunderbolt carries roughly 425 rounds per gun, almost 900 pounds of ammunition. At typical convergence distances, usually around 300 yards, the ballistic paths intersect in a tight zone of destruction. Anything inside that zone faces a storm of half-inch projectiles arriving faster than human reflexes can react. When those bullets hit aluminum airframes, the results are not subtle. Wings fail, control surfaces vanish, engines disintegrate. Aircraft do not spiral down, they come apart. The first large-scale demonstration arrives on August 17, 1943, during the deep penetration raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. These missions stretch American escort range to its limit, revealing the Thunderbolt's one major weakness: endurance. Even with drop tanks, the P-47 cannot stay with bombers all the way in and out. But where it can fight, it fights with terrifying effectiveness. Major David Schilling of the 62nd Fighter Squadron encounters a formation of German twin-engine heavy fighters positioning to attack B-17s. These aircraft, built specifically to kill bombers, carry heavy cannon and rockets, but sacrifice maneuverability. Schilling's 4 Thunderbolts roll over from 28,000 feet and dive. A surviving German gunner later recalls the moment with a clarity that borders on disbelief. He fires first. He sees hits. He expects results. The Thunderbolt doesn't even hesitate. Then the American pilot fires. The aircraft ahead of him does not fall. It disintegrates. Wings separate. The fuselage tears open. The crew compartment becomes debris. In seconds, a machine designed to destroy bombers is reduced to fragments. 8 of the German heavy fighters are destroyed in less than a minute. For the Luftwaffe, this is new. Cannon shells have always been their answer. Fewer shots, more explosive power, but cannon require accuracy, timing, and ammunition discipline. The Thunderbolt replaces precision with probability. A 2-second burst from 8 guns can put over 100 bullets into a target area the size of a truck. German pilots begin reporting something unsettling. Even when they score hits, the American fighters keep coming, and when the Americans hit back, survival is often impossible. By late summer 1943, altitude becomes a dividing line. Above roughly 25,000 feet, German fighters begin to lose their edge. Their mechanically supercharged engines struggle as the air thins. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged double Wasp does not. At 30,000 feet, it still delivers power. This imbalance proves fatal. On October 8, 1943, one of Germany's most accomplished fighter leaders leads a formation against American bombers near Bremen. The altitude is high, the air is thin. His aircraft feels heavy, unresponsive. Above him, unseen at first, P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group are already in position. They dive. Robert Johnson, now no longer a novice, lines up a firing pass. The engagement lasts seconds. His report is brutally brief. Fire opened, strikes observed along the fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute. The shock ripples outward. If men with hundreds of missions and years of survival experience can be erased this quickly, the equation has changed. German command begins demanding answers. In late 1943, assessments delivered to senior leadership describe the Thunderbolt in terms that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Exceptional altitude performance, extreme structural strength, firepower that cannot be ignored. But the transformation is not finished. In early 1944, a new variant begins appearing on English airfields, and it removes one of the last German advantages. The P-47D-22 arrives with a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller, fitted with broad paddle blades nearly 13 feet in diameter. These blades bite deep into the air, converting engine power into thrust far more efficiently. Climb rates jump dramatically. Where earlier Thunderbolts struggled upward, the new variants surge. Acceleration improves. Zoom climbs sharpen. Energy recovery becomes faster and more forgiving. German pilots notice immediately. Veterans who once relied on climbing away from American fighters now find themselves followed upward, higher and higher, into airspace where their own engines protest. The paddle blade propeller changes something else as well: the sound. At high power, the blade tips approach transonic speed, producing a deep, rolling thunder that carries for miles. Ground troops learn to recognize it before they see anything. A low, threatening rumble that means fighter bombers are inbound. The name spreads among German soldiers and pilots alike: Donnerschlag, thunderclap. By spring 1944, external fuel tanks solve the Thunderbolt's range problem. With wing tanks or a belly tank attached, P-47s can escort bombers deep into Germany and still fight effectively once the tanks are dropped. The Luftwaffe adapts by shifting focus back to the bombers, hoping to overwhelm the escorts through numbers or surprise. But this requires flying through the Thunderbolt screen, a proposition that grows more lethal by the week. Encounters that once produced laughter now produce silence. German pilots describe the experience in increasingly stark terms. Attacks fail almost instantly. Fighters are destroyed in the first pass. Surviving aircraft scatter or dive away, only to be chased down from above. One veteran later recalls seeing the silhouettes above the sunlit clouds. Thick, unmistakable shapes. Someone makes a joke. No one finishes laughing. They come down too fast. The guns do not chatter in short bursts. They roar in continuous streams. Getting caught in that stream is not a matter of damage control. It is an ending. As American escort fighters multiply, the Thunderbolt's role begins to shift. With P-51 Mustangs gradually assuming long-range escort duties, P-47 units increasingly turn their attention downward. And that is when the aircraft reveals another side of its personality: ground attack. The same attributes that make the Thunderbolt lethal in air combat: durability, firepower, speed, make it devastating against targets on the ground. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition punches through vehicles. Soft targets vanish in seconds. The aircraft can absorb ground fire that would cripple lighter fighters. then bombs are added, then rockets. By mid-1944, later variants carry bomb loads equal to early war medium bombers. High-velocity rockets, each equivalent to artillery shells, hang beneath the wings. German ground commanders experience the results firsthand. Columns disappear, supply lines collapse. Movement becomes suicidal in daylight. The psychological impact rivals the physical destruction. Men abandon vehicles, scatter into ditches, freeze under cover as thunder rolls overhead. The Thunderbolt is no longer just a fighter. It is flying artillery. On June 6, 1944, the shift becomes undeniable. Hundreds of P-47s patrol above the invasion beaches, stacked at every altitude. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones are cut down before they can organize. Those that break through rarely return. The sky belongs to the Americans. In the weeks that follow, Thunderbolts systematically dismantle German mobility in France. Railways are wrecked. Trucks are annihilated. Armored vehicles are hunted relentlessly. Horses, wagons, fuel convoys, nothing moves safely by day. The Wehrmacht adapts the only way it can. It hides. Movement is pushed into darkness. Daylight becomes a liability, but even this delays the inevitable. Logistics choke. Reinforcements arrive too late or not at all. And while Europe burns, the Thunderbolt proves it is not limited to one theater. In the Pacific, vast distances and brutal conditions favor the same qualities. P-47 units operating from primitive airstrips discover that the aircraft thrives where others struggle. Its radial engine tolerates damage, its range expands, its firepower overwhelms lightly built opponents. Japanese pilots, accustomed to nimble but fragile fighters, encounter something entirely different. Cannon shells that once guaranteed kills now produce only smoke and scars. Return fire arrives in overwhelming volume. They begin calling the aircraft monsters. As the war pushes toward its final phase, even the arrival of jet fighters does not remove the Thunderbolt from relevance. Pilots discover that speed alone is not immunity. Jets must take off. Jets must land. Jets must slow to attack bombers. And when they do, the Thunderbolt is waiting. Dives from altitude erase the speed gap. Aiming solutions collapse. Heavy machine guns do the rest. By early 1945, specialized high-performance variants are deployed specifically to counterjets and flying bombs. With boosted engines and refined aerodynamics, they push propeller performance into territory once thought unreachable. German pilots learn the final lesson too late. Speed without protection is not survival. The Thunderbolt has become exactly what its designers intended. A machine that absorbs punishment, delivers overwhelming force, and keeps coming back. And the war is entering its last, most unforgiving chapter. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt is no longer misunderstood. It is anticipated. German pilots do not laugh anymore. They scan the sky constantly, not for shapes in front of them, but for shadows above. Because that is where the danger lives now. High altitude, stacked formations, engines throttled back, pilots waiting with disciplined patience. The Thunderbolt has taught its enemies a cruel lesson. The fight begins long before the first shot is fired. At altitude, American pilots have time. Time to observe, time to choose, time to decide whether the engagement will even happen. German fighters, increasingly short on fuel and spare parts, rarely have that luxury. Reports from late 1944 show a consistent pattern. Luftwaffe pilots scramble under pressure, climb hard, burn precious fuel, and arrive already disadvantaged. Above them, P-47 formations cruise efficiently, rotating top cover, conserving energy, controlling the geometry of the fight. When the Thunderbolts dive, the engagement is already over. German attempts to counter this advantage become increasingly desperate. Anti-aircraft fire intensifies. New camouflage schemes appear. Vehicles scatter under trees. Decoys are deployed. Nothing changes the basic equation: speed, armor, firepower. The Thunderbolt absorbs hits that would kill lighter aircraft. Its pilots learn to fly damaged machines home as a matter of routine. Holes in wings, torn control surfaces, engines running rough. These are no longer emergencies, just problems to manage. Maintenance crews adapt as well. Aircraft are patched, rearmed, refueled, and sent back into the air at astonishing speed. Damaged Thunderbolts are pushed aside, not mourned. Replacements arrive constantly, and then, in January 1945, the Luftwaffe makes its last major gamble, Operation Bodenplatte. On New Year's Day, nearly 900 German fighters launch surprise attacks against Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. The plan is simple: destroy Allied aircraft on the ground, shatter air superiority, buy breathing room for the collapsing front. At first, it works. Thunderbolts burn on runways. Hangars erupt in flame. Ground crews dive for cover. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group, the destruction looks decisive. A captured German pilot is brought to the command post. He gestures toward the smoking wrecks and smirks. What do you think of that? Major George Brookings doesn't hesitate. He points past the burning aircraft to the open hardstands, already being prepared. By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones, he says. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The smirk disappears. Within 2 days, factory-fresh Thunderbolts roll onto the flight line. The losses are erased. The Luftwaffes are not. Operation Bodenplatte costs Germany hundreds of aircraft, and more importantly, irreplaceable pilots, instructors, veterans, leaders. The American losses are real but temporary. The asymmetry is brutal and final. The Thunderbolt is not just winning fights. It is winning the war of attrition. By this stage, production has reached staggering levels. Republic Aviation's factories operate around the clock. Aircraft emerge in steady rhythm, 1 per hour at peak output. Engines arrive by the thousands. Guns, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, all flow continuously across the Atlantic. Each P-47 contains tens of thousands of individual components, miles of wiring, hundreds of pounds of armor, complex turbo supercharger systems assembled with precision that would have been unthinkable under wartime conditions elsewhere. And yet they keep coming. Equally important is the pilot pipeline. By 1944, American training programs are producing tens of thousands of pilots annually. Each arrives in combat with hundreds of flight hours. Formation work, instrument flying, gunnery practice, deflection shooting, emergency procedures. German pilots, by contrast, are rushed to the front with minimal training. Fuel shortages cripple practice flights. Ammunition shortages limit gunnery training. Manuals disappear. Experience dies faster than it can be replaced. When these pilots meet over Europe, the difference is visible immediately. American formations hold discipline under fire. Attacks are coordinated, breaks are timed. Mutual support is automatic. German formations fracture. Survivors describe the same moment repeatedly, seeing Thunderbolts dive in perfect alignment, firing in synchronized passes, exiting together before anyone can react. There is no chaos, no panic, just execution. Captured German pilots later describe physical symptoms tied to Thunderbolt encounters: nausea, trembling, headaches before missions. Medical officers begin documenting what they call jabo fever, a stress response triggered by reports of fighter bombers operating nearby. The sound becomes part of the fear. That deep, rolling thunder, engines at high power, propeller tips slicing air, signals that cover must be found immediately. Soldiers abandon vehicles, crews scatter. Columns dissolve before contact is even made, and the Thunderbolt keeps evolving. Later variants increase fuel capacity further. Wet wings extend range. Reinforced pylons allow heavier bomb loads. Rocket stubs multiply. Performance improves even as weight increases, an inversion of traditional fighter logic. In the Pacific, the long-range P-47N escorts B-29 bombers toward Japan itself. The same aircraft once mocked as short-legged now crosses distances that would have been unthinkable. In 1943, Japanese pilots encounter it and reach the same conclusion German pilots already have. You cannot outlast it, you cannot outgun it, and you cannot rely on it breaking apart when hit. As jet aircraft appear, German hopes briefly rise. Speed promises escape, but speed alone proves insufficient. Jets are vulnerable when slow. They are vulnerable when committed. They are vulnerable when predictable. Thunderbolt pilots learn to wait. Diving attacks from altitude erase the speed gap. Heavy machine guns prove brutally effective against thin jet structures. Several engagements end with jets breaking apart under sustained fire, a result that shocks both sides. The Thunderbolt adapts again. Specialized variants receive engine boost systems, refined aerodynamics, and higher performance ceilings. With water methanol injection, power surges beyond earlier limits. Level speeds approach those of early jets under certain conditions. The message becomes unavoidable. The Thunderbolt cannot be ignored, outrun, or safely challenged. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe exists mostly on paper. Aircraft sit grounded for lack of fuel. Pilots wait without flying. Airfields are cratered, damaged, abandoned. The few remaining combat sorties are brief and fatal. One of the last German pilots trained before the war ends flies a single mission. He sees Thunderbolts diving toward his formation. He attempts to turn. They are too fast. The leader fires from long range. His aircraft shudders violently. The engine explodes. The wing separates. He survives by parachute and watches his entire unit disappear beneath him in seconds. Below, burning aluminum rains down. By now, even senior German commanders speak openly, when allowed, about what the Thunderbolt represents. Not just a machine, but a philosophy, unlimited production, overbuilt systems, redundancy everywhere, firepower emphasized over elegance, survivability over refinement. The P-47 is not designed to win a duel. It is designed to win a war, and it does so relentlessly. In Europe, thousands of enemy aircraft are destroyed in the air and on the ground. Railways are shattered, vehicles vanish, armored formations are crippled. Entire sectors of the front become unusable in daylight. In the Pacific, the same pattern repeats, and behind the statistics lies something harder to measure: morale. German pilots who once mocked American engineering now speak of the Thunderbolt with quiet respect, sometimes fear. Veterans who faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without hesitation describe P-47 encounters as uniquely overwhelming, because the Thunderbolt does not ask permission. It arrives from above. It fires once, and it leaves nothing behind. As the war draws to a close, the aircraft's reputation is complete. What began as an object of ridicule ends as a benchmark, the standard by which all fighter bombers are judged. The laughter of 1943 is gone, replaced by the sound of thunder. When the war ends, the Thunderbolt is still flying, not because it has survived by chance, but because it was built to survive by design. As Allied forces push into Germany in early 1945, Luftwaffe airfields are found abandoned, cratered, stripped of fuel and aircraft. Hangars stand empty. Runways are torn apart. In many places, the infrastructure exists, but the Air Force does not. The Luftwaffe has not been defeated in one decisive battle. It has been worn down, dismantled piece by piece until there is nothing left to contest the sky. And throughout that process, the Thunderbolt has been a constant presence. By the final months of the war, American fighter-bomber units fly almost without opposition. Missions that once required careful planning and heavy escort now proceed with near impunity. Thunderbolts patrol roads, rail lines, supply depots, bridges, striking targets almost at will. German movement in daylight becomes nearly impossible. Even the feared 80 mm anti-aircraft guns struggle to respond effectively. The Thunderbolt's speed at low altitude compresses engagement windows to seconds. Pilots weave slightly, fire once, and are gone before flak crews can correct their aim. For ground troops, survival becomes a matter of sound. That deep, mechanical roar means cover must be found immediately. Vehicles are abandoned, columns scatter, men throw themselves into ditches and tree lines. The psychological impact spreads faster than the aircraft themselves. The Thunderbolt no longer needs to destroy everything it attacks. It only needs to be heard. As statistics are compiled after the war, the scale of destruction becomes clear. Tens of thousands of vehicles destroyed, thousands of aircraft eliminated in the air and on the ground, rail systems shattered, entire divisions immobilized by air power alone. And yet numbers do not fully explain what happened, because the Thunderbolt's real victory is not measured in kills. It is measured in inevitability. Republic Aviation produces more than 15,000 P-47s during the war. At peak output, factories operate around the clock, delivering aircraft faster than combat units can lose them. Engines, guns, ammunition, fuel, all arrive in quantities that dwarf anything the Axis powers can match. Each Thunderbolt requires thousands of precision-machined parts, miles of wiring, complex turbo supercharger systems, heavy armor integrated directly into the structure, systems duplicated and backed up, and yet they are assembled by workers who, only years earlier, had never seen a fighter aircraft. Many are women. Many learn on the job. Quality control does not decline under pressure. It improves. The same is true of ammunition. Every sortie consumes thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Factories respond by producing millions of rounds monthly, each manufactured to tight tolerances, ensuring reliable feeding even under extreme G-forces. Fuel consumption is massive. The logistics required to keep Thunderbolts flying are enormous, but the supply chain holds, stretching from American refineries to European airfields without breaking. The Luftwaffe cannot compete with this, but production alone is not enough. The pilots matter. By 1944, American pilots arrive in combat theaters with hundreds of flight hours. They have trained extensively in formation flying, gunnery, navigation, emergency procedures. They have studied enemy aircraft, analyzed combat footage, practiced deflection shooting against towed targets. They know what their aircraft can do, and what it should never attempt. German pilots, by contrast, enter combat increasingly underprepared. Fuel shortages limit training. Ammunition shortages restrict live fire practice. Experienced instructors are dead or flying combat missions themselves. The result is not subtle. American pilots fly with confidence rooted in preparation. German pilots fly with courage. But courage unsupported by resources has limits. When engagements occur on equal numerical terms, Thunderbolt units consistently prevail, not because the aircraft turns better or climbs faster in isolation, but because it survives mistakes, punishes exposure, and allows pilots to disengage at will. After the war, debates emerge. Some argue the Thunderbolt won through numbers rather than quality, that lighter fighters were technically superior but overwhelmed by mass. Combat records suggest otherwise. Where encounters are documented clearly, With comparable numbers and conditions, the Thunderbolt's combination of durability, firepower, and energy control proves decisive. The 8 heavy machine guns, once dismissed as inferior to cannon, demonstrate their effectiveness repeatedly. Gun camera analysis reveals why. Cannon shells are destructive but limited in number. They demand precision. Miss by a small margin and the opportunity is gone. The Thunderbolt's guns create a cloud of probability. At typical engagement ranges, even short bursts deliver multiple hits. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds penetrate before igniting, shredding internal structures and starting fires deep inside airframes. Aircraft struck do not limp away. They cease to exist. The P-47 becomes, by definition, the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight exceeds the loaded weight of some twin-engine aircraft. Its engine produces more power than entire bomber formations of the previous war, and yet it is flown by young men barely out of training, maintained in mud and snow, and repaired under combat conditions with speed and confidence. It is not elegant, it is effective. In 1945, captured German documents reveal a complete reversal of assessment. Early evaluations dismiss the Thunderbolt as clumsy and inferior. Later updates mark it as a critical threat. Final reports describe it as unsurvivable in direct engagement. The laughter is gone from the paperwork. Years later, former adversaries meet at reunions and museums. Old pilots talk openly without propaganda or pressure. When asked about the Thunderbolt, their responses are consistent. They underestimated it. They misunderstood it. They assumed air combat would be decided by maneuver and finesse, as it had been in earlier wars. They did not anticipate a fighter built around survivability, redundancy, and overwhelming firepower, backed by an industrial system capable of replacing losses without pause. One former German fighter leader summarizes it bluntly. "We thought the Americans built a bomber and called it a fighter," he says. "We were wrong. They built a fighter that could take punishment and deliver it endlessly." He describes flying a captured Thunderbolt after the war. The power, the stability, the sense that the aircraft wanted to keep flying no matter what. But what impresses him most is not the machine itself. It is the realization that America built thousands of them, while fighting across 2 oceans. That is when he understands the outcome had never truly been in doubt. The Thunderbolt does not just defeat aircraft, it defeats assumptions. It proves that in modern warfare, the side that can absorb damage, learn quickly, and produce relentlessly will eventually dominate the battlefield, regardless of early ridicule or initial setbacks. The P-47 enters combat as a curiosity, a joke, a flying milk bottle. It exits the war as a benchmark. The sound of its guns becomes synonymous with destruction. The thunder of its approach signals inevitability. German pilots who once mocked its size now associate it with sudden death from above. By May 1945, there is no one left to laugh. The skies belong to the Thunderbolt, and the lesson it leaves behind is simple, brutal, and enduring. Wars are not won by perfection. They are won by machines that keep coming back.